Councilors, can you take your seat, please?
Yeah, just when he's done, you'll say, just say, I'll know now. When he's done, that way you can see the full screen. 'Cause right now you gotta have full screen.
Yeah.
You know, so.
We have to hit this button, right? Or we already.
Let me call the City Council Committee of the Whole to order. Please all rise to salute the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Would you please remain standing for a moment of silence as we honor our service personnel and in particular those who have given the ultimate sacrifice. Thank you. Under the provisions of the open meeting law, let me announce that this meeting will be recorded, both audio and video. So let us begin by having the clerk please call the roll.
Kamel. Kamel here. Condon. Condon here. Crow. Here. DeMaria. Here. Linehan. Here. Murphy. Here. O'Malley. Sika. Here. Spatafora. Winslow. Winslow here. Anderson.
Anderson here. First order of business.
See, public hearing, page 542-21. Nathaniel Kramer, assessor, will appear before the council to hold a tax classification remote public hearing. Order that the city council adopt a residential exemption of 30% and a residential factor of 1.75 or 0.901998 for the fiscal year 2022 tax rate.
So we have Mr. Kramer before us to make the presentation. Let me fire up your microphone, sir, and tell us where we are.
Good evening. Good to see all you guys in person. So the purpose of tonight's hearing is to select, oh, you know what? I can't control the PowerPoint on the shared screen. I can't control that. Oh, wait. There we go. Got it. Okay, sorry about that. So the purpose of tonight's hearing is to the selection of a minimum residential factor and the granting of a residential exemption. The minimum residential factor, a factor of 1 would yield a single tax rate of $10.95 per thousand of value. In Malden, that would only be the case for the commercial properties because of the residential exemption in place. If we had a minimum residential factor of 1, the residential rate would still be around $13. For the FY22, the tax levy is $101,685,688, and that's how the math up there is how we get to that single tax rate. Chapter 200 allows communities to select a factor of less than 1, thereby shifting more of the tax burden onto the CIP classes of properties. Historically, Malden has chosen to go with the max shift of 1.75. This slide is just to show what's going on in the market and in the time frame that we're talking about. So fiscal 22 is based on a valuation date of January 1, 2021, using sales from calendar year 2020. So surprisingly, from 2019 to 2020, the residential market only went up about 3.5%. So I just wanted to make that clear because everyone knows how crazy the market is right now, but most of those value increases have actually occurred in calendar 21, which you see on that graph as well. These are the different options for shifting. You can see there a shift of 1. The residential tax rate would still be $13.69 because of the residential exemption. And moving on through them, the residential tax rate decreases until you get to a 1.75 with a FY22 tax rate of $12.35 and a CIP rate of $19.17. This is the estimated tax amounts for the residential. The FY22 average value is $651,973. That's inclusive of all of the residential properties. Single-family home value, average value is around $503,000. The max shift, you can't see my mouse up there, but a shift of 1, the estimated bill without the residential exemption would be $8,926, where the max shift, the average residential bill would be around $8,052. And here are those same numbers for the CIP class. Average value is $1,054,899. So as I mentioned before, the estimated tax rates for fiscal 22 are $12.35 for residential, that's with the max shift, and $19.17 for commercial, industrial, and personal properties. And these can change slightly depending on what happens with the DOR approval process. And below that is a history of tax rates back to 2019. For the residential exemption, the city can elect to go up to 35%. Only 16 communities statewide have adopted the residential exemption. Malden adopted it in 2008. The residential exemption in 2021 was $2,323.40. Of the 12,593 residential properties, about 80, actually I have an exact number, that we're currently 8,291 properties received the exemption, which is down from last year. Last year was 8,359. There is a break-even point with the residential exemption. So properties that are worth $977,000 or more don't realize the benefit, and as the value increases, they actually begin to pay more. And here's a breakdown of the properties that wouldn't benefit from the residential exemption. So there are 7 single-family homes that don't benefit from the exemption, and so on. 23 two-families, 23 three-families, and a good portion of the apartment buildings don't benefit.
And explain a little bit more about why they don't benefit.
Because their value is so the 111 class, which is 4 to 8 unit apartments, and the 112 class, which is 9+ apartments, including complexes like Granada Highlands that has over 900 units.
Yes.
They're in the residential class. So once that value surpasses that break-even point of $977,000, $977 is zero. You're not getting any benefit at all. Over that, you begin to pay more because you're carrying those lower value properties that are getting the exemption.
So I just asked you that question so that the residents at home, those who are watching this, who aren't so steeped in all this language that you're using, will understand. So I want you to explain this as if you were talking to people who don't have all this full understanding. So why are we doing this? Who does it benefit? And who are the exemptions? I guess I'd like you to kind of hit it from that angle. Would you please? Can you do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure you can.
So the residential exemption is in place to lessen the burden on owner-occupied residents.
Right.
last year, basically what it does is it reduces the taxable value of a property. So at fiscal 21, in fiscal 21, the average residential value was $640,000, but the 30% residential exemption reduced the taxable value by $188,895.
So the city of Malden continues to get the same amount of revenue coming in. It's just the burden is shifted away from those owner-occupied residents to whom? Who does it get shifted to?
The higher valued properties that are in the residential class. So it stays in the residential class.
Okay.
That's important. So the commercial class does not pick up any of that.
Okay.
Here is the average tax bill from fiscal 21 to fiscal 22. You can see the residential values, and that's why I brought up that slide in the beginning. Actually only went up 3.5% in 2020. The residential tax rate in fiscal 20 was $12.29, and the fiscal 22 is an increase of 6 cents to $12.35. The average residential tax bill this is without the exemption, is increasing $307. So the same numbers for the commercial, industrial, and personal properties. This increase on the bottom line there, that's showing a $1,669 or 8.9% increase on the commercial properties. That number is skewed because of the 504 utility class. All the utility properties are now valued differently because of the Department of Revenue required us to value them differently, which greatly increased their values. They went up about 50% last year. So that's what. So the actual increase of 1,669. It's less than that. The number's skewed because of that 504 class. 504 is public utilities: National Grid, Boston Gas, Eversource. Here are nearby communities that also have the residential exemption. On the left side, where it lists the community, it also lists the percentage of the exemption that they chose. So Boston's at 35%, Cambridge is at 30%, Everett is at 25%, Somerville is at 35%, Chelsea is at 35%, and Malden is at 30%. And you can see the average residential tax bill in the far right column. I believe Everett is the only one of those communities that has a lower average residential tax bill. I'm sorry, Chelsea and Everett. And here is the tax shift for the neighboring communities. So this is regardless of whether or not they have an exemption. These are just border towns. Everyone goes with the 1.75 shift except for Melrose, and that's likely because they weren't allowed to. And that wraps up the presentation. Now we can take questions if you like. The Board of Assessors is recommending that we stay with the 1.75 shift and a residential exemption of 30% for fiscal 22.
Okay, so let me, there's a motion here to suspend rules, I believe, that is necessary to have this before us this evening. Would someone make that motion, please? That was Councilor Murphy, seconded by Councilor Winslow, to suspend. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say nay. Those rules are suspended. So now let me open this as a public hearing, and Mr. Kramer has made his presentation. Are there questions? I know there is somebody who wants to speak from the public. Are there questions from the council who would like to speak? Let me see. That it looks like Councilor Kamel is the first who would like to speak.
Hey, Nate, thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. It was more concise and to the point. previous ones. So anyways, sorry. Anyways, put my foot in my mouth there. So when you say the average of 629, this might be an easy question, I hope so. Not to be the math nerd, but the average of 629 for the single family home. I mean, to be that guy, is that median value or is it mean of like all the single family value homes divided by?
So the average of 629 was last year's average.
Oh, I'm sorry, 651.
And that was the whole residential class. So the average for fiscal '22 is 651,973. The average single-family value is around 503.
Oh, okay. And that's 650, so I guess that's my question. Is the 651, I apologize, is 651 just the mean?
Average of all the residential.
Okay. So not like not like the median of them.
Nope,
It's
total
just the-
residential value
Great.
divided by number of residential parcels.
Sorry, and one more, just to follow up, the average single family was 5.
I believe it's 503.
Thank you. That's it.
It's harder to pin down just the single-family class with the residential exemption. Number one, because it's all shifted, but also DOR doesn't publish the information for other communities that have the residential exemption, so it would be impossible for me to make a good comparison.
Thank you very much, just wanted to.
Welcome.
Thank you. Councilor Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have two questions. My favorite one is obviously the properties that fall outside of the residential tax exemption. If you could go back to that screen that shows the 7 single families. It's a wonderful program unless you own one of those 7 families. There we go, okay. So basically, it's, 101, 104, and 105 that really concern me. So just to give people an idea, so property that's valued over the 977, those actually do not get benefit of, let's say, the $2,000 reduction, okay? But they actually, do you know what type of a percentage increase they see over and above? So they start at 0.
Yep, so at 977, it's 0. They're just paying,
977
it's
is
as if
0.
there's no exemption.
And then how does it percentage-wise go up from there? So property that's worth
Percentage-wise,
maybe,
I
let's say, 1.2 million.
So I actually have the presentation with me that I did in March that I can show you. I think I have an example of a $1.5 million building.
Okay.
And it shows how much more they would have paid in 2021.
Okay.
Do you want me to bring that up?
Is it easy for you to find it?
Yep.
And then my next question is going to have to do with, is in your presentation, you showed the chart of the fact that really we're not seeing the increase in this particular presentation that we will see next year.
Right.
And when you look at 111, 112, those units will see, I'm assuming, a substantial increase, which are mostly rental units, which I'm assuming will be passed on to tenants because the landlord's not going to keep it. So I'm just, we're always talking about trying to keep Malden affordable.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just kind of, I want people to understand there's a yin and a yang to this, that, we are pushing more of the burden onto non-owner occupied properties where tenants live.
Right.
Who are struggling to pay rent. And as we increase the base of this through the residential tax exemption, especially with the increase that's going to come with the values, there could be next year a very disproportionate increase to our tenant base. So just something we need to think about. I know there's been some talk about going to 35%, which I think would just exacerbate that situation. But, something to look really into next year. But for this year, I'd just be nice to know, what are we seeing? How much movement is there?
So, you mean for next year?
Well, no, next year we'll deal with next year. I know next year is going to be an issue. And I think next year we might even have to look at the 30%, should it be 25%, depending on, you know, how this all fleshes out, but,
So I don't know that it would be an issue.
You don't think so?
Typically, when values go up, the rates come down.
okay,
So there
Think
is a
it'll
seesaw
even out?
effect there,
Okay.
so I wouldn't say it's an issue.
Okay.
I would just probably expect the rates to come down.
okay. But for those of folks who haven't seen this before, if you can just give us an indication from your March presentation, what the increase would be for the owner-occupied properties that fall outside of the 977.
I'm actually having trouble getting that up on the screen, but I can tell you for for fiscal '21, a $1.5 million building would end up paying, that doesn't get the residential exemption, ends up paying $3,675 more than if we didn't have the exemption. That's for fiscal '21.
Okay, thank you. Just so everyone realizes that there's a yin and a yang to this.
Yeah.
So,
And it goes up from, we have, for instance, Granada Highlands, it's, you know, pushing 200 million. So they're really paying,
a lot more.
yeah.
So, anyway, okay, thank you.
Yeah, can you explain a bit, Nate, about the, I know we had talked about having some discussion of going to 35%. I think even Councilor Spatafor we put in a resolution to look at that, so explain a little bit about the recommendation to stay with 30% rather than recommend 35%. Thank you.
I was hearing you. Can you just repeat what you just said? I was hearing you twice.
Okay.
Actually, on my computer and.
Yeah, I know, I think over the past year, I think the last time this came up, there was the discussion of we could go to a 35% exemption and wanted to understand the Board of Assessors rationale in recommending 30% rather than 35%, so.
To Councilor Murphy's point, I feel like to increase it even more, the city has thousands of residents living in apartments. And those larger apartment complexes would have an increased burden. And I don't think they would just take that sitting down. So I think to go to 35%, I mean, you can see you actually can't see, but on a $1.5 million building, they're already paying almost $4,000 more to cover those lower valued properties. So you can imagine the large apartment complexes, if they were to carry even more, they would just pass that cost off to the tenants, and we'd have thousands of residents whose rents would just go up because of it.
All right, thank you.
All set, Councilor Winslow? Councilor O'Malley?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I think we've kind of hit the nail on the head. Increased property values are great if you plan on taking out money and leveraging your asset, but it largely results in larger insurance bills, larger tax bills. So it is something that we need to balance here with the tax rate. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the utility company assets that we discussed. I'm glad to hear that the state has revalued or changed how we're valuing them. We've seen a lot of new gas lines installed in Malden by National Grid. We've seen a number of new infrastructure with Comcast, particularly here in the downtown. And Verizon and other utility companies have been rolling out small cell antennas across the city. I'm assuming that all counts under new growth and wouldn't impact our levy?
Actually, none of it counted as new growth because none of it was new. We just valued it differently. So it was just spread out across the class. So there is new growth in the utility class, but not because of the different valuation.
Understood. But when that does happen, that personal property is making it back to your ledger, so that every small cell antenna that has a value of who knows how much, $10,000, is being assessed against the utility company, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I mean, that's the benefit of having new infrastructure. You know, if you've depreciated an asset over 100 years and your gas lines are leaking, and you now install new gas lines, I'm assuming that those have a higher value, which is why that increase has been so significant. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Councilor Di Maria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Nate, for your presentation. It was great and concise, and it was good. I do want to just, in particular, want to give you a minute to shine on the work that you've done with the tax exempt properties in the city, as we, as a body, discussed in 2019. And I think it's fabulous. So if you want to boast on some of your numbers, go right ahead.
Sure. That was, you know, even during my interview process, something that kept coming up, so I knew it was something that had to be looked at when I came in. So we changed the whole process internally. I don't want to get too boring for you guys, but the way we don't automatically roll anybody now. So in the past, if a property was put into a trust or maybe a child bought the house, the office would work to try to figure that out and then roll those people to the next year. And then if they're, you know, if it was obvious that it was a new person, those people would get applications. But now we just automatically, doesn't matter whose name is on it or what if it's a trust or whatever it is, if it was a property that was getting the residential exemption that transferred, they're automatically removed and they get new applications. And I think that was a big, that really reduced the number, but also the building department and the health department have been huge. If they are inspecting a property and they can see if they're getting the exemption, but it's sometimes obvious that the owner doesn't live there.
Right.
And same with the health department. They do the inspections of the rental units, and they also will notify us if it's obvious the owner doesn't live there, and they can also see if they're getting the exemption. So
Yeah.
it's been great. I think last year we had 8,359 people, and right now we're at 8,291.
Right. I just pulled up your email. But at one point, we were 8,600. Is that right?
Back in 2014, Steve and I were looking at it today, was it 2014? It was 8,604.
Oof.
That's 8604
That's how many,
people that were claiming residential exemptions.
Yeah.
And by your new process, you've reduced that down to, what's the number again?
8,291 right now. Applications aren't due until April 1st. So it could change.
Yeah. Great work on your department and Steve Farmer and his department and all those that were involved. That's lost revenue that we now have, so thank you, Nate.
Thank you.
I know in a conversation that you and I had just yesterday, you were talking about some property where the owner was claiming exemptions in 2 different locations of property that they owned,
And lived in
and the
Medford.
person actually lives in Medford.
Yeah.
So, yes, good work. Yeah, how about that, huh? Once again, Councilor O'Malley looked like he's looking to speak again. Councilor O'Malley?
I apologize.
No problem.
On that route, how does it work when a tax exempt entity doesn't use that property for a tax exempt purpose? So for instance, they are a tax exempt entity, but they're instead using it for a retail space or renting it out to a third party.
It's taxable.
It's taxable. And how are we auditing that?
I'm sorry, what?
How do we audit that? How do we catch that?
They remain, I think I know who you're talking about. They remain taxable until they show me that it's being used for the school. They have to send me a letter.
And if it's just vacant?
Just vacant, that's a really good question. Do you want to just say this?
No, we'll follow up. We can follow, rather than we'll follow up, but, thank you.
Follow up with me.
Thank you.
You can't answer that without divulging the, I think it's, you've raised it. Let's play it out a little bit more without divulging who you're talking about.
So
in
plans
particular.
have changed.
Okay, talk it out.
So initially, when those properties were closed on, the buyer shared their plans with me. And we determined, based on what they shared with us, that 2 of the properties would become exempt next year, and 1 of them would remain taxable. But in the past couple of days, I've learned that those plans may have changed. So we'll figure that out as we go. But even though they purchased those properties in 2022, they're still taxable until the following fiscal year. So those.
So what you're describing is you're giving more scrutiny to you're not just taking everyone at their word, but you're giving more scrutiny to their applications and making sure that you're doing the diligence that's needed to assure that they're properly being exempted.
Yes.
And if they're not, they're still taxable. That's the answer to that question.
Yes.
Okay. All right, I don't see any other councilors' request. Let's open it up to the audience. Anyone wishing to speak in favor of the tax exemption? Being recommended. Anyone wishing to speak in opposition? In favor of this? Seeing none, hearing none, I'll declare that portion of the hearing closed. Anyone wishing to speak in opposition to the presentation? Anyone wishing to speak in opposition? Hearing none, seeing none, I'll declare that portion of the hearing to be closed. Okay. So I'm reminded that you can stop sharing your screen, and there may be people, since we're Zooming this, there may be people at home who are participating in the meeting from virtually that may have questions or comments that they'd like to raise. So if you can stop sharing your screen there, I would appreciate that.
No, I don't want to leave.
See that you can fix all of our tax records and so forth,
I know, I can't use
but
Zoom.
clearing the screen, that's a challenge, huh?
There we go.
There we go.
I think I'm out now too. Oh, it's back.
Screen sharing has stopped. Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
That's still my screen.
Looks like what do we have, 1 participant that I see there? Okay, that's you. Okay. I don't see anyone else wishing to speak. Councilor Kamel for comments or motion.
Motion to adopt the order.
Councilor Kamel's motion to adopt the order, seconded by Councilor Di Maria. The clerk, please call the roll.
Kamel. Yes. Condon. Crow. Yes. Di Maria. Yes. Linehan. Yes. Murphy. Murphy, yes. O'Malley. Yep. Sika. Yes. Winslow. Winslow, yes. Anderson.
Anderson, yes. That order has been adopted. Next order of business.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fine presentation. Thank you very much.
Paper 543-21, order that the following position be given special municipal employee status. Person who holds this position works periodically providing assistance to the Inspectional Services Department on an on-call as-needed basis as a non-benefited, non-regular employee and must meet one of the following criteria. 1 is not paid. 2 is part-time, allowing the person the flexibility to work at another job during normal working hours if the person chooses. Or 3, has not been paid by the City of Malden for more than 800 working hours during the preceding 365 days.
On Councilor Crow's.
Motion to refer to rules and ordinance.
On Councilor Crow's motion that we refer this to rules and ordinance, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. That'll be referred to rules and ordinance. Next order of business.
Docket is clear.
The docket is clear. I see no request. Do I see request for personal privilege? No. Then on the motion by Councilor Kamel that we adjourn, all those in favor say aye. Opposed say nay. We are adjourned. Thank you, sir.
Mr. President.
All righty.
Thank you. Yeah, can I get you to sign that thing we just passed for Nate?
Sure. It's easy to try to track me down later, huh?
I'll get Gary to sign it tomorrow.
Okay. Am I approve it and then, am I on top of the bottom?
Let me see where he's at.
What's that?
Oh, he's on the bottom.
He's in the bottom.
Thank you.
There you go, sir. I went online yesterday to do that, setting up the campaign finance stuff with the state.
Yeah.
And the bank that I currently use is not one of those that's aligned with the bank, Century Bank, which has now been merged into
With Easton, yeah.
And neither Easton or Century are part of their system. I may have to take my few little dollars out of Century and move them.
Really? A bank like Easton wouldn't be,
Not on the list. There aren't that many on the list. There are probably maybe
the Citizens must be on.
Citizens is there. Yeah, Bank of America, I think is
Those
there.
bastards.
Rockland might be there.
Didn't Rockland just sell too?
I don't know.
Yeah, no, East Boston. Well, Rockland bought East Boston. Maybe that's right.
Okay. Yeah, there's,
Isn't that fun?
so I was reminding some of the other councilors.
Good, because they sent me an email today, and I was gonna send something out tomorrow, because the people that hasn't sent out
Deadline.
yet. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those, like, Councilor Kamel, he's probably going to, close his committee up, so he doesn't have to do it.
Right.
And then, so we just have to get it set up, and then in January, report this year's activities to Malden.
Yep.
And then going forward, starting in
Right,
January.
correct.
So I figured that I'm still gonna get requests for tickets and advertisement, stuff like that. I'm not gonna spend down on
So
that.
it sounds like you just gotta close it out and bring it to whatever's convenient for you. I have Century for a lot of things. I like that bank. You know, it's still like a Malden bank.
Still a community
Yeah,
bank,
yeah. I've had a checking account at Easton for my first checking account ever.
Yeah.
So I've always saved that, but I always enjoyed working at Century.
Yeah, I've got about 5 accounts there.
Yeah. I got my mortgage with them.
I got my mortgage. Hi, Ryan.
Got prison.
Who was the counselor when you first ran in before you?
Who was just before this time?
No,
Or the original time? His name was Phil Weiner.
I was not, sir.
He's
He's a judge?
an international judge. I think.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
And then what's interesting, when he decided he wasn't gonna run, his father
Harold.
ran.
That's right, he did run. Harold.
And his father tried to use pictures of himself 20 years earlier and took his son's sign and cut out the re-electing. And he tried to run under the pretense that he was his son.
Is he around now? Phil Weiner?
I don't know.
Philly, they call him, Philly, yeah.
Interesting guy, interesting history.
Yeah, I mean, I heard about it, so I figured it out.
Yeah, he was there. Yeah, there were always Jewish city councilors, with the exception of Herbie Jackson, who was Ward 7. But all before that, they were all Jewish. And the whole neighborhood, there were about 5 temples there. So,
Well, that's when the Jewish community was still
well,
in
it was, you know, mine was a breakaway. And
Well, thank you, I figured you would know, you're the person that
The historian here.
All right, you too.
What's his name?
Your mic is still on.